Where Winds Meet is a Wuxia story, and if you're new to this genre, that can feel intimidating in ways that aren't immediately obvious, because it operates on a set of assumptions, values, and symbols that are easily understood by Chinese people, but tend to be surrounded in mystery to the average Westerner. Where Winds Meet was my first real exposure to Wuxia storytelling, and while I was deeply drawn to the world, I also found myself pausing often and trying to understand why the story framed certain moments the way it did. Over time, that confusion turned into context, and context turned into appreciation. That understanding didn't come only from learning history and theory, but also from the patience and insight of the Chinese Where Winds Meet community, who took the time to explain how these stories are meant to be read and understood. This video has no spoilers or summaries. Instead, it is a toolbox for you to use when approaching the story. With that in mind, let's start at the beginning. What Wuxia actually is and what it expects from people who step into its world. The term Wuxia is made up of two characters, Wu meaning martial skill or martial arts, and Xia meaning righteousness and chivalry. Together, they describe moral action expressed through martial ability. Thus, a typical Wuxia story centers on people who live by personal codes of honor and justice, often acting outside formal authority. It's important to understand that this distance from formal authority is not a grand rejection of order or a theme of personal rebellion. Instead, it reflects a belief in balance and the recognition that systems of power, while necessary to a functioning society, do not always act justly. Any good story would not exist without conflict. In Wuxia, conflict arises because the structures meant to govern fairly have failed or fallen into chaos. It is within this uncertainty that Wuxia stories take place, not during times of stability, but at moments when moral responsibility shifts from institutions to people. What distinguishes Wuxia from stories that are simply historical or fantastical is its emphasis on ethical choice over destiny. Heroes are not chosen by prophecy, nor do they wield supernatural power to save the world on their own. They are ordinary people, shaped by circumstance, who act when balance has been disrupted, often reluctantly and guided by duty to the greater good, rather than personal desire. It's also important to understand that while Wuxia rejects the common Western theme of a chosen one superhero, it does not reject the idea of exceptional people. Wuxia heroes are extraordinary, but not because power is granted to them from the outside. Instead, they rise from ordinary lives and become extraordinary through virtue, extreme discipline in martial arts, the strength of character to do the right thing even when the odds are directly against them, and the heart to sacrifice everything, not for a specific person they care about, but for the safety of people they may never get to meet or talk to. To be extraordinary in Wuxia is to stand against chaos with restraint and integrity. In Where Winds Meet, understanding this framework helps explain why characters act quietly rather than dramatically, why sacrifice is treated as noble rather than tragic, and why the story consistently asks not what someone can do, but what they must do when the moment arrives. With that foundation in place, we can now look at some of the key concepts and themes that appear repeatedly in Wuxia stories, including Where Winds Meet. One reason the term Jianghu often causes confusion for Western audiences is that it gets mistaken for the name of a world, when in reality it functions more like a shared framework. To understand it, imagine if I recommended you a game that's set in medieval fantasy Europe. Even before I explain the plot, from that description alone, you can already picture some possible common themes of the setting. There are probably knights and castles, magic probably exists in some form, there may be dragons, elves, dwarves, ancient artifacts, old gods, and abandoned ruins. The details vary from story to story, but the term medieval fantasy itself carries a set of assumptions that help you understand the kind of world you're entering before you know anything else. Jianghu works in a similar way, but instead of describing a fantasy setting, it describes a social and moral landscape with its own assumed elements. Literally meaning rivers and lakes, the Jianghu refers to a world that exists alongside official society. When a story takes place in the Jianghu, certain things are implicitly present. You can expect martial artists trained in distinct schools, wandering swordsmen, sects with long histories, Shaolin monks, assassins, healers, and people who have stepped outside ordinary life. Authority in the Jianghu comes from skill and restraint. A monk, a doctor, or a swordsman may all command respect, not because of who they serve, but because of who they have proven themselves to be. Importantly, the Jianghu is not a separate realm cut off from the rest of society. It intertwines with everyday life and responds directly to its failures. When governments are stable and just, the Jianghu fades into the background. When institutions become corrupt, the Jianghu becomes active, stepping in to resolve conflicts that official systems have failed to address. In this sense, the Jianghu is less a physical place and more a condition, one that emerges when people believe balance must be restored through personal action rather than formal authority. Understanding the Jianghu this way helps explain why characters in Wuxia stories recognize one another by reputation alone, why sect affiliations carry so much weight, and why conflicts are often resolved through personal encounters. Martial arts in the Jianghu aren't only fighting styles, but a reflection of one's inner self, a discipline that is a personal legacy, a kind of mark that brands a person with a hint of who they are. Earlier, when talking about Wuxia, I mentioned that good stories cannot happen without conflict. In Wuxia, that conflict usually takes the form of moral or social imbalance. The response to that imbalance is the Jianghu itself. Much like hearing medieval fantasy immediately brings certain expectations to mind, invoking the Jianghu signals that something is out of balance and that the story will follow those who step forward to restore that balance. With that understanding of Wuxia and the Jianghu in place, we can now talk about the mandate of heaven, a concept that shapes how order and responsibility function in these stories. The word heaven here can be misleading to Western audiences. It is a translation that doesn't fully capture the original meaning because this is not a personal divine being that people pray to or expect miracles from. Instead, this heaven refers to a cosmic and moral order, a way of observing whether the world is in balance or not. Heaven does not intervene directly in response to prayers. It bestows that intervention onto the common people. When rulers act justly and society remains balanced, they are said to possess heaven's mandate. When corruption and chaos spread, that mandate is understood to be lost. Wuxia heroes are not agents of heaven, but respondents to it. In this sense, the mandate of heaven is not about destiny, but about consequence. It explains why stories focus on ordinary people stepping up during times of collapse, why restoring balance matters more than personal victory, and why the Jianghu exists as a moral space where action fills the gap left by failing systems. Seen through this lens, the mandate of heaven is the thread that ties Wuxia and the Jianghu together. History tells us when balance was lost. Wuxia shows how people respond to that loss, and the Jianghu is where those responses take shape. It's worth taking a moment to explore common meaningful themes in Wuxia stories, because many of the ideas they rely on can feel unfamiliar when viewed through a Western storytelling lens, which runs the risk of completely losing the entire point of why a certain event in the story is powerful or meaningful. One of the most persistent ideas in Wuxia is that times of chaos give rise to heroes. Closely tied to this is the Confucianist belief that the world is not saved by one person, but by collective virtue of a generation. Order is restored not through a lone savior, but through many people making difficult, principled choices over time. This is why Wuxia stories often feel less interested in individual triumph and more focused on shared experiences. Collective stability outweighs individual tragedy, and personal suffering is often framed as meaningful if it contributes to restoring balance for others. This leads to another key distinction. Noble sacrifice is treated as triumphant rather than tragic. In Western narratives, sacrifice sometimes emphasizes loss or injustice. In Wuxia, sacrifice is frequently presented as fulfillment. Giving something up, even one's life, is not framed as senseless if it preserves moral order or protects the many. The emotional weight comes not from what is lost, but from what is upheld. the focus is inherently different, not on the individual's suffering, but on what collective benefit that suffering enables. Wuxia also places greater importance on destiny over personal freedom, though not in the sense of fate being imposed from above. Destiny here reflects responsibility shaped by circumstance. Contrasting a common Western perspective that everyone has the right to act as they believe, in Wuxia, the concept of having the right to ignore imbalance without consequence is not entertained. When the world is out of order, the question is not what someone wants to do, but what must be done. Personal desire is secondary to moral necessity. This is why the main character in a Wuxia story is rarely a powerful chosen one or a superhero figure. Instead, they function as a reflection of others and of the mandate of heaven itself. They are a common person who steps forward at the right moment, embodying values that already exist within the world. Their importance comes not from exceptional power, but from their willingness to act when action is required. Keeping these themes in mind changes how the story is read. Endings may feel unresolved if one expects personal closure rather than restored balance. And history itself becomes more than background. It becomes the source of the moral pressure that makes these choices necessary. Before we move into history, it's worth clarifying what this section is and what it isn't. Chinese history is vast, layered, and deeply worth learning in its own right. But that isn't the goal here. What follows is a highly selective look at real historical events that directly shape the world of Where Winds Meet, chosen only because they have explicit influence on the story and its characters. This is real Chinese history that the game repeatedly draws from to create the narrative. You don't need to memorize dates or names to enjoy the story, but understanding a handful of these events makes it much easier to grasp it. The main story quest of Where Winds Meet begins in the year 962, which is a very fragile period when the wounds of the world have not yet even begun to heal. Qinghe and Kaifang lie under the rule of the Song dynasty, but the Song is only 2 years old at this point. It was founded right after the Five Dynasties period, a half-century defined by rapid regime changes, warlord rule, betrayal from within, and constant bloodshed. The present-day Song dynasty inherited an exhausted nation. Because of that, the Song's current priority is stability, centralization, and control. To the north, the greatest unresolved pressure comes from Khitan Liao dynasty, a rival power built on military strength, pursuing expansion through military aggression and territorial leverage rather than constant conquest. 26 years ago, during the Five Dynasties period, the Yanyun 16 prefectures were ceded to the Khitans by a ruler seeking their support. This was a great loss of strategic land, but also a profound act of betrayal. With Yanyun under Khitan rule, the northern border lives under constant tension, shaped by the pressure of their presence. To the south, the southern Tang remains not as an open enemy, but as a lingering remnant of the old order. In 962, it survives through diplomacy and tribute. Its continued existence is a quieter pressure on the Song because it is a persistent reminder that unification is not yet complete. 16 years ago, during the Five Dynasties period, these pressures came to a breaking point. During the Battle of Jianghu Bridge, General Du Chongwei betrayed his own dynasty, defecting to the Khitans and abandoning his ally Wang Qing in the middle of battle that otherwise could have been won. Left with his forces pinned against the river and without support, Wang Qing and his soldiers were slaughtered. Much like the loss of Yanyun, this was another terrible act of betrayal, with the Khitan Liao pressure once again causing catastrophic loss of life. In the final years of the Five Dynasties period, desperation ran so deep that even sacred boundaries eroded. Buddhist statues were melted down for copper, an act widely frowned upon and bordering on sacrilege, but justified at the time due to a severe material shortage. It was not an attack on belief, but a desperate measure taken when resources ran out. When the Song finally took power, Tang Dynasty coins were systematically melted down and replaced. Currency was centralized, standardized, and reissued under Song authority, a deliberate act meant to signal that the old order was truly over, sacrificing the lives and comfort of the present few to ensure a more stable future in the eyes of the Song. And this brings us to the present day in the game. In 962, life under the Song feels different depending on where you stand. In Kaifeng, the capital, there is a cautious sense of order returning. Bureaucracy functions again, markets reopen, and officials project confidence. But beneath that structure is a population that remembers how quickly dynasties collapse. While you and I know that the Song dynasty will endure for a long time, for the people living at the time, the Song is only 2 years old. After the Five Dynasties period, when rulers and regimes changed with unsettling frequency, faith in any government's longevity is hard-earned. In Qinghe, closer to the northern border, that sense of security is thinner. Military presence is heavier, memories of conflict are more immediate, and the authority of the state feels more conditional. People here are not dreaming of prosperity or reform, they're hoping for continuity, for a government that lasts longer than the last one, and for a peace that actually, finally lasts. Politically, the Song presents itself as legitimate, restrained, and moral, but it governs a population shaped by betrayal, scarcity, and repeated collapse. Socially, people have learned to rely on personal bonds, reputation, and obligation just as much as on law or office. This is the world Where Winds Meet opens into. A land where authority exists, but trust in that authority is still fragile. Where betrayal is a recurring, painful memory, and where order is new enough that many are still watching to see whether it will hold. It is within this landscape that the Jianghu persists, not as an opposition to the state, but as a parallel, moral space that fills the gaps left by fragile institutions, where disputes are settled, debts are honored, and justice is pursued through personal reputation rather than official decree. By this point, you've seen the two forces that shape Where Winds Meet laid out side by side. On one hand, Wuxia storytelling with its emphasis on moral obligation, collective responsibility, and the belief that balance is restored not by institutions, but by people willing to act when they must. On the other, a historical world marked by collapse, betrayal, scarcity, and a population that has learned, through experience, that order is fragile. What gives Where Winds Meet its particular weight is not either of these elements on their own, but the way they intertwine to tell the story. The turbulence of the Five Dynasties period explains why Wuxia values take root so deeply here. Decades of instability taught people that dynasties rise and fall, borders shift, and even sacred institutions can fail under pressure. When systems prove unreliable, meaning moves into a quiet understanding that if balance is to be restored, it will be restored by the hands of the common people. And this is where the Jianghu emerges. So when you step into the world of Where Winds Meet, you are not entering a fantasy setting that exists in its own fictional bubble. Real history explains why the present feels cautious, why trust is limited, and why characters often act with a sense of inevitability rather than hope. Wuxia explains why, despite all of this, the story still believes in moral action, in balance restored through effort and responsibility, rather than miracles or chosen heroes. In a land shaped by repeated collapse, order does not return all at once. It is rebuilt gradually, by people willing to act when institutions fail. That belief is where Wuxia and history come together, and it is the lens through which Where Winds Meet asks to be understood. Building on what we've covered here, I'm currently working on a full Qinghe lore summary, one that looks beyond just the main story to examine the broader narrative and lore surrounding Qinghe, including its characters, side stories, and the historical forces that connect them. If this video helped you find your footing, that project is meant to be a deeper exploration once you're ready for it. So please look forward to it. And thank you for watching.